Continuing education knows that at the end of the day, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we really listen to their needs, and we can offer them flexible options both within continuing education and across the campus.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Miller, and I'm a teacher here at CU. And we'll jump right in. Welcome. So today is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026. It is 9 a.m., and the title of this session is Africa, Opportunity in the World's Richest Continent. We're going to kick off with our land acknowledgement. So the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. Next, I want to just kind of give a heads up for the Q&A of our session. I'm a big fan of jumping into Q&A as quickly as possible, and here's how it's going to work. We want to ensure that everybody has a chance to ask a question. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for this Q&A, and we're using a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, simply raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. And we have our producers in the back. They're both coordinated wearing blue. Thank you guys for helping. And when you finish raising your hand at the producer, they'll bring it up to me. And then if you're a student, please note that on your card. And in your questions, just try and be as legible as possible and be brief. So again, welcome everyone. My name is Eric Miller. I'm a teacher here at CU Boulder, and I'm the executive director of the Deming Center for Entrepreneurship. Of note on this panel is I've led an economic development program called Rural Colorado Workshop Series for the past 12 years throughout our state. We've helped over 900 rural and native entrepreneurs start and grow ventures. And in addition, I spend a month every year in Cape Town, South Africa with this fine gentleman, Lavoyo, by the way, helping disadvantaged entrepreneurs in the townships move their venture forward. So the continent of Africa has always been near and dear to me and special in many different ways. And I'm so excited to have our panelists share thoughts in that regard. So when I was looking at our panel, here's a quick summary that came up. Thrilled to be joined by an amazing group of panelists. We have a panelist who started a tech empire in the boot of his car, a diplomat who traded war zones for rural Vermont, a banker who became a press freedom fighter, and the woman who taught New York City how to speak 10 languages. So with that, I'm so thrilled to be joined by Abubakar, Lizzie, Lavoyo, and Ozzy, and I'll share a brief background. A couple of sentences, and I always like to find a little fun fact about our guest as well that I'll share. So first up is Abubakar Jamai is the Dean of the Donna Dillon Manning School of Global Affairs at the American College of the Mediterranean. He's also one of Morocco's most decorated journalists, and he actually started in high finance. In 1993, he co-founded Morocco's first ever independent investment bank, Upline Securities. He basically went from managing the country's first privatization IPOs to becoming the watchdog who questioned the very systems he helped build. And the fun fact that I found out about Abubakar is that he gave a TEDx talk in Carthage, Tunisia in 2011 with a title, and I want to learn more about this, a title of Madness 2.0, the madness of believing in ourselves. I want to learn more about that. And it was in French, so thank goodness for Google Translate to really understand what he was saying. And then next up is Lizzie Shackelford. She's a distinguished lecturer with the Dickey Center at Dartmouth College and a foreign affairs columnist for the Chicago Tribune. The power of the pen, Lizzie is famous for a dissent cable, a formal protest that she wrote while serving as a diplomat in South Sudan. When she felt the U.S. government wasn't doing enough to protect human rights there, she didn't just stay quiet. She resigned in a high-profile protest and turned that experience into the acclaimed book, The Dissent Channel. She's a living example of speaking truth into your power. Fun fact I found out about Lizzie, she's from Mississippi and did a study abroad while she was studying at Duke in South Africa. And the study abroad was supposed to be 1 month, ended up turning out to be a year. So she spent some time in the Cape as well. Next up is Lavoy Irani, co-founder and CEO of Salulu Technologies and founder of the Salulu Foundation. In addition, he is co-chair of Africa Forward, working to achieve sustainable development goals by 2030. He's been awarded as Social Entrepreneur of the Year by the Schwab Foundation, and he lives in Cape Town with his son and wife. And as I mentioned, I have the honor of spending a month every year with Lavoy for the past 15 years in our global seminar every year. And a fun fact about Lavoy, he is one heck of a dancer. He enjoys dancing at every moment he gets a chance to, and he's wonderful. And I have proof of this because I have video that he dances with our CU students in Cape Town at the waterfront every year, and it's super fun. So perhaps we'll get a little dance moves later. We'll see. We'll check in on that. And then finally, we have Azia Khalili, Executive Director of Humanity in Action and a lifelong feminist changemaker dedicated to advancing global social justice. She served as the founding Executive Director of the NYC Commission on Gender Equity and has led significant initiatives in philanthropy and nonprofit sectors for decades. If you see a government sign in New York City today that isn't in English, there's a direct line from that sign back to Ozzy's persistence. She is the woman who literally gave the city's marginalized communities a voice in their own tongue. And a fun fact about Ozzy is she's visited 40 countries, speaks 3 languages fluently, and I had to smile at this one, and she shared, and I have a teenage daughter that keeps me humble. So Lavoy, Lizzie, Abubakar, and Ozzy, thanks so much and welcome. Yeah, round of applause, yeah. So let's do this. To start off, let's have each of you share kind of an initial thought on the topic of Africa, opportunity in the world's richest continent. How is the world of international business reshaping the African continent? And also, please share any additional background information that you'd like to, that maybe I had missed. And let's start with Ozzy, an opening thought or remark about our topic today.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to be here, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I am Ozzy Khalili. I was born and raised in Iran, and I do need to say that I'm not African, and I'm trying to be humble about being on this panel. I ran a not-for-profit organization over 10 years ago, and we were an international organization, and we had offices all in Africa and in Asia, and I worked in South Africa, in Soweto, stopping the spread of HIV. And very quickly, my organization that was based in the US, very quickly we learned that we needed to listen to the community in Soweto about their needs, about the strategies that they thought would work, and that we could not walk in with our imperialist ideas of what works and what doesn't work. So I do want to start by saying that Africa has rich culture, rich history, land, and the people are incredible, like humans are incredible anywhere on earth, and that the wealth in Africa has been systematically extracted for centuries. Rather than, it's been extracted and brought to the global north rather than that wealth being invested in Africa for the people of Africa. That I think that any one of us who wants to think about development needs to always keep the history of a nation in mind or a continent in mind, and for us to go back to the history of enslavement. And enslavement did not just steal 12 million people from Africa. It stole possibilities, it disrupted societies, and redirected the trajectory of a whole continent. The colonial era was not just, it was not about development. It was really about redesigning extraction of resources from a continent. Borders were drawn for the convenience of Europeans, and economies were structured for export, and institutions were built to serve extraction of resources. So if we keep all of that in mind, then of course, then we can proceed to thinking about, okay, what about wealth? And when we talk about development, I always want to ask the question, who's being developed? Thank you very much.
Probably the reason why I'm on this panel is I'm African, I guess. I'm from Morocco, North Africa, although for many international organizations, Morocco is part of the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, and not Sub-Saharan Africa, and probably our subject to this mostly about Sub-Saharan Africa. But still, I'm very attached to my African identity, and anyone who has visited Morocco, and especially certain, if you've been to Marrakesh, you are in Africa in Marrakesh. So. And we'd like to think, and we are in competition with the Egyptians, that we are the most African Arab country, Amazigh country in the Arab world. And I have my angle of analysis is really political economy. It's something that I struggled with in my home country in Morocco. It's something that keeps me interested. And when I look at Africa, this is the angle that the perspective I use to analyze this region of the world. If you look up Africa today in the media, etc., there seems to be a positive vibe about the continent. And this positive vibe is based on some success stories. Some countries have developed in an interesting way, are showing a lot of potential. One of the reasons for this positive vibe is really the potential. Africa is 20% of the world population, is 3% of its global GDP. So it means that there is potential there. It's only 2% of its global trade. One of the positive development is in terms of funding development. More and more Africans invest in their own development. So one stereotypical view of Africa is that Africa cannot stand without aid, by itself. Well, aid is only the third source of hard currency in Africa. The first one is remittances, and the second one is FDI. So there are more foreign direct investment in Africa than aid. Africa is not suffering from a big problem that most of the countries in the world are suffering from today, and that's demographic decline, or the potential for demographic decline. Africa has more than the fertility rate is beyond 4 kids per woman, which is more than a healthy rate, which means, if you're a business person, you should be interested by that because it means a bigger market, right? Another view that nurtures this or feeds into this positive view is the mineral wealth of Africa. It has been calculated that Africa has $8.6 trillion of untapped mineral wealth. So these are all contributing to this positive vibe. But I'd like also to underscore what might be the problem in the future with all of that. So I just mentioned that Africa gets more FDI than aid, that there are more remittances, which means nationals working away from Africa, but we are still struggling in Africa with something called the poverty trap, right? And one of the mistakes we should make when we talk about Africa, which I have been making since I started speaking, is that there isn't Africa, there are African countries, and there are 54 of them with very, very different levels of development, levels not only of economic development, but also of institutional development. So we should be careful when we talk about Africa and overgeneralize. The poverty trap is a serious problem. It has been, people got Nobel Prizes for working on that, this is still a big question. Can certain countries, or at least certain sections of societies in certain countries, really integrate the process of development without a boost from aid? That's doubtful. There are certain countries, there are certain regions in Africa that need some kind of wealth transfer from the wealthiest parts of the globe. I'm very curious to hear from Azi, for example, how is that impacting fighting AIDS, for example. And we need to also remember something. Globalization gets a lot of flack right now, but there is one thing about globalization that worked wonderfully in a sense, and that's fighting global poverty. If there is one element about globalization, you look at the averages, at the numbers, there is a huge reduction in global poverty thanks to globalization. But the problem is most of these successes happened in Asia, in China, India, etc. Africa was left out of this positive side of globalization. So poverty is still a serious problem in Africa, and the poverty trap, I'm not going to go into details, is a situation where it's not that people are dumb or not smart, but when you wake up in the morning and your first priority is to go fetch water to yourself, you don't become an entrepreneur all of a sudden, because your mind, your mental space is occupied by this very, very basic need. So it's not that there is, on the contrary, one of the things that are contributing to this positive vibe is entrepreneurship in Africa, and there are many, many success stories in terms of entrepreneurship, but we're still fighting this scourge of absolute poverty. The other issue is the demographic, what's called the demographic dividend, and I mentioned that earlier as a positive side. It's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword because either you have the right institution to provide jobs for this youth, and then you have what's called the demographic dividend. You have more people being productive than people being on the being supported by the society, which means more young people than infants and than kids and elderly. And if you don't have that type of institution, you end up with uprisings, you end up with revolutions, you end up with... this is important for Africa specifically because Africa is victim of something which is called the resource curse. And it's one of the closest thing in political science to mathematics, right? And it says that if you are a country with a lot of mineral wealth, chances are that it will be very hard for you to democratize. The countries that are very rich minerally today that are democracies, it's because they had, prior to finding this mineral wealth, they already had democratic institutions. By the way, it's the case of the United States, of Norway, etc. But countries that still don't have solid democratic institutions and find mineral wealth, generally it's very, very hard for them to graduate to democracy. So that needs to be kept in mind for Africa.
Great.
And I will finish.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I will finish by the fact that this is a particularly important point because one of the qualifications of the system in Africa is corruption. We need to remember, and I'm basically following on what Azi had said, you have a corrupted and you have a corrupter. Right? And unfortunately, what's happening right now is there is a dismantlement of the international legal architecture to fight corruption. Starting here in the US, as you probably know, the Trump administration has ceased to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act a few months ago, and that's not the right moment to do that for, to help Africa to develop, because it puts the whole corruption thing on steroid if you are not watchful about these practices. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Abubakar. A lot to unpack there. We'll get into a little bit more detail in a sec. Lizzie, what are your initial thoughts on this topic?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's great to be here. I come to this, of course, not as an African, as a former U.S. diplomat who spent a lot of my career on the continent, though. I am not too proud to admit that I first arrived on the continent in South Africa, Cape Town, love it, in the late 90s as a student. And I was a well-meaning do-gooder who ended up volunteering, who went over with all of these ideas about how good Americans are going to save the world. And it didn't take a long time to really start to open my eyes about how things were a little bit more complicated than I might have been raised to believe. So I do come to this topic with humility of someone who, particularly as a U.S. diplomat, tried to bring to bear the kind of power and influence and support of the United States in good ways, and saw repeatedly how a lot of that kind of aid infrastructure and U.S. foreign policy really undermined a lot of what I thought our goals were on the continent. And so I'll use as an example one of the ones that's really struck me early on when I was actually a consultant working for USAID before I became a diplomat. I was in Uganda conducting an assessment of the business environment, and I was traveling around the world doing this in different countries. I learned a lot. I have no idea what these reports were used for otherwise. But I remember visiting one USAID project in Kampala where they were handing out seeds to try to help farmers have greater productivity. And then the next day I traveled a few miles down the road and visited another USAID project where they were helping entrepreneurs learn to sell seeds. And I went back and I had my kind of concluding meeting with the mission director, and I was like, that doesn't seem like we're doing things particularly logically or well. It doesn't seem sustainable. It doesn't seem like a lot of what we're doing is built to then kind of help growth that can move away from aid. So that's just one of the many examples I saw in my time working in different parts of Africa. As Abubakar said, it's wide ranging, right? All of these countries are very different. But the time that we're in right now, again, looking at this from kind of a foreign policy perspective and an American perspective, or the role of the U.S. in the West, is that the horrific way that a U.S. Assistance was just gutted over the past year is incredibly damaging, and it will lead to many, many unnecessary deaths. Not because the continent desperately needs all of this aid, but because we had built a system where we reinforced dependence on it, and then to rapidly take all of that away is far more costly, I think, than had it not been there in the first place in some ways. So I think that we can't really underestimate how serious that cost is, that completely unnecessary pain and suffering to a lot of people. My hope is that on the other side of this, we will have stopped that cycle of kind of almost intentional dependency, and countries across Africa will no longer have these kind of imposed Western obstacles to building on the great wealth in that country, in that continent. And I don't know how this is going to happen. I hope that, African countries can effectively play off the great powers against each other to get things better for them. I hope that African countries, through things like the African Free Trade Agreement and other ways, can kind of build, have that power in numbers to be able to kind of build up their, build up the trade market that's going to be massive as that population gets so big. But I think that there's a lot to be done between Africa's potential today and really realizing that potential in the future. And I hope that different African governments and African businesses will be able to take advantage of things like this shift to trade not aid that the U.S. administration is now pushing, and do so for the benefit of the people and businesses in Africa rather than kind of external sources from the West.
Thanks so much, Lizzie and Navoyo.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's been an honor, and thank again to be invited to come again from last year. My name is Luvuyo Khani. I'm born in the Eastern Cape in South Africa and based now in Cape Town. So I kind of grew up in a space where in the time of the apartheid to the time of the transition for South Africa. So able to experience the impact of the apartheid in terms of local, and also where my mother used to run a shipping and used to be arrested and then come back and run the business. And I think that has shaped me to be a resilience, and the resilience of Africa that comes in about. Because after study teaching, and I see a need, and I see the need of digital divide, and I started opening these cyber cafe training centers, and it grows across the South Africa, and beyond that, I see that the biggest problem around us, as you talk about it, is the unemployment of young people, and I started to support through the entrepreneurship program, which is where allows a young person in Cape Town and around South Africa to start their own business. But also seeing that the biggest problem that we're finding in, and I think it's probably something that I'll probably talk more about, it's from Africa point of view, it's about the need of supporting social innovators. Because this social problem that we talk about, they will be solved by social innovators. And hence now, I work in the continent now to support the social innovators now. So on this topic, how is so important and how much more relevant now? I kind of like share the challenges that Africa at the moment, and also share the opportunity that we're sitting now. But we're sitting at a transition of the country. And we speak so well about the timing. So the timing at the moment is a timing of positivity, the timing of the energy. There's many changes that's taking place in the continent now, around African Union, around the governance now. So what is the biggest stumbling block and the challenges around the continent? It's on the leadership. That's the biggest problem in terms of leaders that are leading Africa, that able to, not to sell Africa, able to build for Africa. So that's one part, the leadership. Second, AI. AI, it's the biggest opportunity for Africa to leapfrog, but it's an opportunity that can create more poverty for Africa, because data, it's the big part. Big organizations are looking up now, and part of the leaders can sell that kind of data now. So that's the second part. And the third problem, it's on Africa has got 54 countries. There's no unity at the moment. So once Africa speaks in one voice, that's a change. And I could see now there's a beginning of realization now. Africa has to speak one voice. The reason why, currently we're sitting at 1.4 billion population. By 2050, it will be 2.5 billion. Nigeria was going to be the biggest economy, which is sitting at 250,000, 250 million people, about 500 millions now. And by 2050, out of the 10 child, 4 will come from Africa, which means that you cannot ignore it anywhere now. It's the main biggest opportunity that comes in now. So where are the opportunities for Africa? And last year, through the G20, with the World Economic Forum, African Union, and Africa Forward, where we lead now. For the first time, there was a study on social entrepreneurs in the continent. And the study was, the continent has got about 2.2 million social entrepreneurs that are in the continent. Out of that 2.4, they bring about $96 million of the revenue, and they employ about 15 million. 64% are driven by women. In the continent, there's only one country that recognizes social entrepreneurs. It's Senegal. It's only now that you see in Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire that recognizing now. Out of the 51 states, they are not recognizing social innovators. So how important, why there's a need of social innovators now? The continent of Africa, driven by young people now, is been driven by them solving this social problem through innovation. If you go to Kenya, go to Nairobi, you see energy around the tech solution. Go to Cape Town, go to Egypt, you see the energy of young people now. They are taking over and then around that now. So that's one part in terms of like this energy now comes like. And then probably another second point, which is opportunity comes in now. When USAID took place last year, February, and then the president decided not to, providing USAID, it was a devastating opportunity, but it was a wake-up call for Africans not to depend on aid, and saying that what is needed now, as much as we are solving these problems, we need social innovators, which is where we still solve the social problem, but have sustainability now. It has shifted, people of Africa now to look at themselves now and say that we are not going to wait for aid, we will continue showing the world now. So this is the beginning of something that, as Africans now, and I think from the part of your hope, the hope it won't be on the politician, on the leaders, it will be people, young people of Africa, and the social innovators of Africa to shape Africa.
Wow, thanks so much for those amazing thoughts as we jump into this topic. So just a quick check-in. I'll have a couple of more questions for our guests, and then we'll have a fun little session. Our guests can ask a question of each other, and then we'll throw it over to your questions. So I see some questions coming in. If you do have a question, start thinking about those, and we'll get to those as well. Ozzy, why don't we return back to you? And get your thoughts. You know, economic growth is often measured in GDP, but rarely in dignity. How can we ensure that this wave of international investment creates social equity rather than just extracting value and economic value as well?
Thank you for that question. I think that we need to rethink systems of extraction, and like, for example, in this moment with USAID being gutted, there are tremendous opportunities for self-dependence, and also opportunities for listening to the ground, listening to the people of what are their needs, and what are the solutions they are recommending. I'm a strong believer that people who are closest to the problems know the solutions. So we need to build that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. And Abubakar, I want to get back to a phrase that you said that I think a number of folks have shared as well, this positive vibe in Africa. I really like that. The question is, what are 2 or 3 things that the continent needs to do to amplify that positive vibe?
Well, I think the institutional aspect is absolutely important. I think that we need to go back to the basics of what makes a country thriving economically, but also socially, etc. So it means institutions that are geared toward generating growth, but also geared toward redistributing a modicum of this wealth so these countries are balanced. Because one of the main lessons, in fact, I mentioned globalization. The big negative aspect of globalization is that it's a very unequal process. And this unequal process leads to the rise of extremism in many countries. You know, there are many theories about the rise of extremism in many countries, and in the West in particular. And to me, the most convincing argument is the argument that globalization went too far and not taking care of, in fact, some sections of the society in these countries. So we need to be careful about that in Africa. So the very neoliberal view of just let entrepreneurship and etc. It to me might have a boomerang effect. It's very important that this growth is an equitable growth. It's a growth that is well redistributed, because otherwise it will spoil the whole process.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And Lizzie, a question for you. You know, from a diplomatic and systemic standpoint, how should the rest of the world shift its engagement from seeing Africa as kind of a project to be managed to seeing it as a peer to be partnered with?
Well, I think there's a really wide range between kind of where the United States was a year ago and where it is today, which is, I was reading an article yesterday talking about how they're trying to make sure every embassy has deal-making teams. And as a former diplomat, that sounds a little strange to me. But I think that there is, that happy medium in there, which I don't think that, the West and the rest of the world is going to come to on its own, is a place where everyone is benefiting, where those partnerships and commercial engagements and diplomatic engagements are bringing positive outcomes for everyone. I don't actually think the administration of this country really believes in that concept, that kind of mutual gain concept. But I think that in a lot of ways, cautious optimism, I do think that China's engagement in Africa is a lot closer to that than what the United States' engagement in Africa has been in the past. China is doing it for its own selfish gains, for its own access to critical minerals, for its own kind of influence on the global stage. African countries make up, I want to say, about 28% of the UN General Assembly votes. That's a very, very large chunk of votes. So when you're talking about that diplomatic stance, China has found a way to basically bring things that African countries need. And I say this with a caveat. Yes, we know there's debt diplomacy and issues like that. But again, we're finding some range in between these. But bringing things like infrastructure, like highways. I lived in Nairobi before. The highway that the Chinese put into the airport in there, I'm going to tell you, everybody notices that difference, right? The train that they put into the coast, everybody has noticed that difference. And so I think that the key now is to find out what countries outside can get from Africa, can work with different African countries to facilitate. Do they need more investments in energy to make that kind of production of things more economical, so that they can build out more trade externally, for example? But my last point, I just think that African countries, again, this has come up a couple times, there are many different African countries, but there is that strength in numbers that I do believe really could help in terms of that negotiating power on the outside with those partnerships and in foreign affairs. And I think that in order to find that balance, African countries should really find ways to work together to leverage that when vis-a-vis trying to get what they need from other countries.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I love the threads of diplomacy and economics and human dignity that we're kind of sharing insights on. Lavoyo is a very successful entrepreneur that has built businesses and bridged kind of the gap between township realities and the traditional economy. What are one or two things that global investors may be missing in terms of the opportunity of investing into the continent of Africa?
Thanks so much. I mean, I think the biggest miss on the continent, it's missing the grassroots innovation and grassroots entrepreneurs, grassroots change makers, because that's where the solution are. They are closer to the problems. They're understanding what's the need. So it's not able to look at that as part of the solution. And I'm talking about it based on working in the township, in the rural areas where the deeper need is and where the bulk of people in Africa are residing in now. And if you want to change, the continent, you have to make sure that you include everyone as part of the change. You don't, able to focusing on the, established, peri-urban areas, because what you do then, you, create two economies. You could see in Africa that bulk of the economy is informal, and there are a few countries like that, like probably there are top 5 countries that they're structured now: South Africa, Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria. That you see that probably the economy of the countries is residing with that, and I think it's something that has to be looked at now in terms of how you could bring in those solutions now, and the theme is more localize it to globalize it, so that you can have the local solution becomes a global solutions now, and that's what the need to be looked at to see and able to change with that. And I like with Liz talk about it, and because it's like one of the problem around the diplomacy. You see that in China there's one diplomacy, in Europe there's one, in India one, but in Africa there's 54 countries, and that becomes like divide and rule. And if Africa comes one, and you have one, engagement, that's the power, because the biggest challenges with the US and the China. And the China is kind of like, as much as you see this infrastructure that they have it, but also it's the benefit of the China, because the China is like exploring the Africa. And there's nothing that Africa can do except that they can become united. And that unity have give them leverage to negotiate better deals for the peoples of Africa. And that's what, at the moment, the Western Chinese are using advantage of this fragmentation where, I mean, part of the deals are done in a different way, because every leader in the continent wants to do the best deal and short-term deal now. Whereas if they can come together, that's the solution for the peoples of the continent.
And I'd love to jump in on that thread, because that's come up a number of times, 54 separate countries. Maybe each of you could share one idea. What is one idea that can be implemented to decrease that fragmentation, allow these 54 countries to come together and collaborate more? Ozzy, is there one thought to share in that regard?
Well, I think we've seen this around the globe for the Global South to recognize divide and conquer strategies and name them for what they are. And I think that the Global South has united itself. We see this more and more and more in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, where there is collaboration around policies, there's collaboration in negotiating with the United States, Germany, England, etc., and also for standing as a bloc at the UN. I think the UN can also play a very important role. We mentioned that Africans have over 20% of the vote, but I think that many African nations have been kept out of many of the committees at the UN, including, I think, the Security Council. And there's a lot to be done at the UN. Thanks.
Great. Boubacar, a thought on how these 54 countries can connect more and collaborate on a higher level?
Lizzie mentioned an important initiative that is being implemented, albeit a little bit at a glacial pace, but still it's important, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area, and that would be a game changer, because one of the and I know that from a Moroccan perspective, I can tell you this sorry state of free trade agreements or free trade in Northern Africa is, if you are an investor and you are a Moroccan investor and you want to invest or to sell your products in Tunisia or Algeria, you better be in Marseille or in Florence than be in Rabat or Casablanca, because the EU has free trade agreements with all the individual North African countries, and you can multiply that to the whole of the African continent. So it's a very important evolution that we need to see happen, is that we have more intra-trade in the continent, and that has to happen through the free trade agreement. We can say whatever we want about the EU, and the EU has a democratic deficit, etc., etc., but the EU has achieved a lot of things, and we should never forget that it started with free trade agreements, internal free trade agreements. So to me, that would be a priority.
Great point. Thank you. Lizzie?
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up the same. I do think that at the end of the day, the strongest version of Africa on the world stage would be something that has some elements similar to the EU. I think it starts with free trade. I think you're starting to see different regions take things on, like, East Africa has an East Africa visa, so you can get that one visa and travel around that region. I think finding a way where you can get a lot of the same kind of, you get your the standardization of different standards for things like agricultural products and pharmaceutical products and things across, if not the entire continent, at least large sections, and then maybe that weaves together ultimately. But making it easier and lowering the costs of doing business is going to be tremendously important for Africa to be able to compete in things that aren't just extractive. And I do think that you're seeing a recognition of that, but I mean, it's very slow. It's a long way to go. It is a hard thing to negotiate. It's a big kind of diplomatic achievement, but I think that would probably be one of the most important things that could happen.
Awesome. Thanks, Lavoyo.
Yeah, no, I can't agree with that. The free trade agreement is quite important, and you could see the importance of also the blocks, SADC, ECOWAS. You kind of, creating so much more trade in the different, areas of Africa to make sure that there's a strength that, and you also see some great initiatives that you are seeing, like Ghana, where now you can get a visa. To come. Not a visa, a passport now to come to Ghana, and it's kind of make it easy for anyone to, even US, to go be citizen of Ghana. The way that they really see the trade, and And the biggest, also probably three challenges, I mean, for the collaboration, it's the cost of doing business in Africa is quite expensive. And then secondly, the traveling for Africa. It's easy to come US, to come to Europe. It's difficult to go from Cape Town to Nigeria. You have to go to Europe before you come to Africa, instead of like go to Africa. So for that, if you could make it easy for traveling, and thirdly, there is more trade, I mean, through China and US and Europe, more than trade amongst Africans. And that's how they could change that in terms of create more crates in terms of the continent.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that. So I've got a number of questions here we're going to jump into. First, I want to pause and open it up to our panelists. Would you like to ask any questions of each other to learn insights? Yeah, Lizzie.
This just occurred to me as we were talking, but I am curious if anyone here thinks that there would be a path to a continent-wide currency and whether that would be good or bad.
I don't, if I may, I don't see that happening. And I think the big debate right now is the dollar position, and you're probably following, what's going on with that. And there is attempts led by China and other countries to come up with an alternative to the dollar. And I'm more convinced by those who claim that the dollar will be very, very hard to dethrone right now. And I'm saying this because obviously, I mean, if China is unable to come up with an alternative currency, if the euro, although it's doing well, has not dethroned the dollar, you can only imagine how it might be difficult for the African continent. But I think the value of having that as a goal is tremendous, because it focuses the minds, right? So I'm not sure it's attainable, but I'm pretty sure that if we Africans have that ambition, it will actually help us advance on many other levels, institutionally, commercially, etc.
Yeah, I mean, it's been talked about it on the part of the BRICS to kind of create a currency that the BRICS members, they could able to utilize it as opposite. But I think it's too early now. I mean, there's some kind of confidence amongst Africans to kind of create, and it will happen at some point. I mean, that will happen at some point, which you could see the financial fintech. I mean, if you look at M-Pesa from Kenya, Uganda, across the country, part of the kind of the East Africa is part of the trade that is using kind of the mobile. So with the innovation and technology, I think those are kind of things that are going to take place and make it easy, and the cost of doing business become much more easier.
Awesome. We got time for one more. Any other question you'd like to share with each other?
I have a question to Lizzie and Azzy, and you mentioned
Your microphone, yeah.
I have a question for Lizzie and Azzy. You mentioned the dismantlement of USAID and its impact. I think it's too important to stay at the general level. Can you just tell us what was this impact, really? Because I think I have seen some numbers that are horrendous, but you are obviously experienced. You worked on this. You worked on AIDS. As a diplomat, you worked on these things. Can you just make it a little bit more granular to us, what it meant?
Well, I can just say that specifically around public health, which is my experience with Africa, is that it has been devastating around funding of prevention programs, specifically also funding of medication. And I know EU is trying to step up, and so is China and India around provision of medication. But I think the cuts, the gutting of those funds have been devastating.
Yeah, I mean, it's literally going to cause, tens of millions of deaths, in the next couple of decades, is what I've read about what sort of the calculations of the people who have been able to kind of crunch the numbers of the actual impact. But if you want to kind of think about, there are the immediate term scenarios, which were literally people on, rounds of medication that then they no longer had access to, immediately. I mean, children dying immediately because they didn't have those opportunities. People who were relying on humanitarian assistance in places where, emergency food. A lot of that came back in some ways. There was like oops, people were dying, I guess we'll refurbish this. But you can't kind of turn those systems off and turn them back on. But one example that I will mention, because I think it really kind of captures the picture, is PEPFAR. PEPFAR is, the most obvious hits are all on the healthcare, but there's a really wide range, but it's just kind of the easiest one to demonstrate. But PEPFAR was one of probably the most successful and acclaimed U.S. Foreign assistance project on Earth. Decades, saved millions of lives, brought HIV/AIDS medication and others all across the continent. Was fundamental in trying to kind of stem the tide of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But what it also did with that massive amount of aid is that it basically made it no longer possible for local doctors, clinics, and healthcare workers to basically run for-profit kind of hospitals and clinics. And so over the course of a generation, it wiped out in a lot of countries, and I saw my experience at the time was much more in East Africa, but I believe it happened all across the continent, is you just saw the higher wages were coming from aid programs, aid-funded programs, and so everybody kind of, the doctors, the talent, the experts fled from those to go to all of these nonprofit clinics and aid programs. So what happens when you turn that off? All healthcare disappears from rural areas across the continent. There was nobody there who had a for-profit option that people could come and affordably pay for medicines or treatments or surgery, because so much of that was dependent on, had basically been wiped out by the free options. So that's when I talk about kind of the impact being worse almost, or perhaps, than it would have been had that aid never been there, is because we built these dependencies over generations. We built these dependencies in IDP and refugee camps that were fully reliant for generations on aid and assistance that then disappeared overnight. Overnight. There was a book that just came out this week it was called Into the Wood Chipper, all about so that probably has a lot of details. But the scale is just massive, and while I do see a future for Africa that will hopefully be better off than it was before, this in-between time, you can't, the cruelty was clearly the point. You can't paper over the impact just on a human level, and you keep mentioning the word dignity, the human dignity that went along with it, I think is a really, a really important concept to think about. That aid that people relied on already kind of undermined that sense of independence, and then taking that away was just, insult to very severe injury.
Wow, thank you for those thoughts, and thanks for the questions of each other. We're going to shift now into your questions, and I've got a little adventurous idea for our panel. Are you guys down for rapid fire Q&A? Let's see how many we can get through here, and we'll do 1 minute headline answers. What do you think? Yeah. Give it a go? All right. Lavoie, you're first up, my friend. And this is from one of our students. And a student asks, it is clear that Africa has been exploited for many centuries. With the stakes of unprecedented climate change, how important is sustainability as this change happens? Would it be wise to compromise on its principles through growth, or how important is sustainability as the African continent grows?
Yeah, it's quite important. It's a very important question, and it's, I'm going to talk about it, that if it's not been looked at, it could be a biggest challenge for the continent if we don't take care of the youth of the continent in terms of the job opportunities, and make sure that the poverty that we see in the continent is being reduced. Now, if we're not doing that, we are able to be a doomed continent. But the possibility that I'm seeing, it's on the Gen Z, that the Gen Z, they're not taking any of those things. They are demanding, and they are kind of making their leaders to make sure that they are accountable. And also with the power of social media, it makes it part of the leaders in the continent to be much more accountability. So there's challenges, but also there's opportunities, and an opportunity resides with the youth of the continent with all these problems.
All right, good job. I think that was like 57 seconds. So we're on track here. Ozzy, I don't know if you would have insight on this, but I'll throw it your way. An interesting question. From visiting Western Kenya, from continuing involvement with the local development project there, I have the impression that Kenyan women are much more productive and trusted than the men are. Is this a cultural problem throughout Africa?
I don't agree with that. I would never agree to saying that women are more trusting than men. I would just say that I have worked with women on the ground, and I think that there is a way that women have to think about their families, have to think about their children. In many communities, women grow food. So I absolutely support projects that fund women's work, but I would not set women and men against one another.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Abubakar, this is a question about infrastructure, and it's around, in the last 10 years, China has really had a lot of inroads into the continent of Africa. In terms of roads, in terms of mining, natural minerals. How do we deal with this in the U.S.?
In fact, I think I read what I think is the fact that now the flows have reversed. Now the African countries are paying back their debts to China more than China is investing in Africa already. So that started, so it's already reversed. What I have to say about the infrastructure question, because this is something that Morocco is dealing with. If you go to Morocco, you'll be mesmerized by the quality of infrastructure. We have a bullet train, which you don't have in the U.S. We have it in Morocco, the quality of highways, etc., etc. But it's not necessarily a good thing. And this is where I go back to my mantra about institutions. Because when you have democratic institutions, what happens is that the priorities of the country are set publicly and they are not the result of the games played by the power elites to basically divert money to their own pockets. And that happened with white elephant investments and infrastructure. So my worry with Africa, and it's a problem that we have in Morocco, is that we have a lot of great things that you can see, but they don't have an impact on people's lives. So to take the case of Morocco, when you look at the infrastructure, you are shocked when you look at the HDI ranking of Morocco, the Human Development Index. We are one of the worst countries in the MENA region. The countries that are beneath us are countries that are literally stricken by civil wars. And why do we have that? Because the money does not go to the priorities, because people don't have a voice. So it's very important that the African continent, benefit from democratic institution that will allow these voices to be carried and to set the priorities right.
Great, thanks so much. And Lizzie, this is a thread that you've shared a lot of insight on already, and perhaps share the next level of detail. What countries on the continent have been most affected by the U.S. foreign aid pullout, and what countries in the world have replaced that U.S. aid, if any?
I don't think that there are any countries that aren't affected and impacted, but of course the poorest ones that have had the highest levels for a very long time of aid are certainly that. And I think that you have a lot of small West African countries that have been receiving a ton of aid and don't have a lot beyond that. A lot of East African countries. I don't know, so many. Sudan with humanitarian assistance. I'm not sure anywhere wasn't really hit. In terms of what countries can really, can come back and fill that up, nobody can. Nobody can fill up that level. I mean, it was less than 1% of America's GDP, but it was still a tremendous amount of money in the countries where it's been going. The EU has been, as you mentioned, the EU has been trying to kind of fill some of that gap in strategic areas. China has been basically, the second we shut down USAID, China became the world's biggest bilateral donor to almost every country there on the continent. And so it changed rapidly. And so even if China hasn't increased it, their influence from using it has. I would say the EU wants probably more to fill the gap, but the EU is also filling a security gap right now as well because of the unreliability of NATO and the US pulling out assistance there. So nobody's going to fill it. I don't think that we will ever rebuild what was there, and I think that's okay because I don't think we necessarily need to. I think the focus now for other countries should be stemming the bleeding of the worst hit places and finding a new system that is more sustainable where that dependence doesn't persist.
Great, thanks so much. I saw a lot of head nodding on that. All right, Lavoyo, with traditional funding pulling back, where can energy, infrastructure, entrepreneurs in general find capital to fund early stage project development?
Yeah, I know it's a big question, and as part of Africa Forward, it's a kind of the task now to say how we can unlock value and funding for social innovators in the continent. And there's some, organization like MasterCard, which support ACP Foundation. So they're supporting, the continent. They believe in the youth of the continent. They're believing in the part of the continent. And also there's a drive in terms of the policy now to say government recognize the social innovators, so also can unlock it, so that recognize now. So we can find similar organization like 501s in US that you could also find in the continent where you could also register that you could be. And also there's look at the cooperative procurement, with organizations that are doing, okay in the continent that seeing the funding. So it's a big opportunity that from the entrepreneurs in the continent are looking for a seed funding or catalyst funding. So we don't look at like the long-term funding, just funding this kind of startups ideas so they can able to flourish. And it's something that the continent, it says that we don't look for grant, we look for patient funding that can build from the continent.
Great, thanks so much. And thanks everybody for your thoughtful questions here. We've got time for a few more here, and then we'll wrap up with a final question and final remarks. Ozzy, this question is from a student. All the countries mentioned, Egypt, South Africa, Senegal, Morocco, Nigeria, are coastal. How can inland Africa begin to enter these conversations and be a part of leading prosperity for Africa?
That's an excellent question. Thank you to the student who asked that question. And I would say that I'm not an expert on Africa, so I cannot answer that.
Then let me throw. Thank you, Ozzy. Yeah. Let me throw it to the rest of the crew. Any thoughts or reactions to that?
Can you repeat?
Yeah. So the students ask. All the countries mentioned, Egypt, South Africa, Senegal, etc., are coastal. So how can inland Africa countries begin to enter these conversations and help lead Africa to prosperity? Any thoughts or reactions to that?
I can chime in. You're already seeing some aspects of like the U.S. focus on things like trade and getting access to critical minerals. They're talking about things like this libido corridor. They're trying to find a way to kind of get critical minerals, critical things that they need from Central Africa, from places inside that are not on the coast. The question is, how do you get things out effectively and economically and safely in a continent where talking about you can't fly from one country to another in many places. If you're trying to fly from one city in DRC to another, you might have to go through Europe. It's like there just aren't the roads and things there. So I think countries, again, banding together and using their leverage to say, you guys want to have access to these mines, build us a railroad, and help build us roads. And this goes back to that patient investment, right? That idea, that's a very big investment. It's going to take a long time to earn it back, but once you do, that kind of access to trade, from having those, lowering the barriers to actually trading from internal Africa to elsewhere, won't just help external countries, but it will also help build inter-African trade, which is abysmal right now. And so I think that's really important, but they've got to band together to be able to use their leverage to get that type of infrastructure funded.
Fantastic. I'm fascinated by this intra-Africa trade topic. I hadn't thought of it that way, but there's a lot of opportunity there for sure. So final two questions as we wrap up. First off, and we'll start down the line with Ozzy here. The year is 2040. If Africa has successfully transitioned from potential to powerhouse, what was the single most important internal shift that made it happen?
I think that a number of us have spoken about this. I would say that we have completely, that Africa has completely moved away from colonial infrastructures, and the priorities of each country, the vision for what they want, their constitution is entirely thought about, has been visioned by the people of those countries.
Great, thanks for starting us off. Boubacar?
I don't have. It's a sequencing of things, actually. So I don't have one, one magic initiative that will solve everything. And I think so. The reason why it's very important, and Lizzie has said it in very articulate way, the intra-trade needs to be developed, because intra-trade means that entrepreneurs like Luvoyo will have bigger markets, and if they see that they have bigger markets, they're going to invest more. That's what it means. And if you invest more, it means that some guy would have the idea of having, to build train and to have, flights, etc., etc. So that's one. But for Luvoyo to be able to do that, he needs the right institution. He needs his property right to be preserved. And so he needs to be sure that the political institutions that are leading with his markets are political institutions that assure him of his property right. In order to have that type of institution, it needs to have an international context which is benign. In other words, we need to have a legal international infrastructure that fights corruption. And that's why I mentioned in my first remarks the problem with the dismantlement of this architecture. We have a problem with cryptocurrencies, because people seems to be mesmerized by cryptocurrencies. But for now, those who have benefited the most from cryptocurrencies are the mafia and people who want to hide money. That's not good for the African continent. So to me, that's the sequence in reverse.
Awesome, thank you. Lizzie?
I'm a big believer in leadership and the power of leadership, and I think that something like that would come if you have not just like one leader of one African country, but at time throughout history you have had moments where people really rose to the challenges in a couple of places, and that timing of having, this leader in this country and this leader in this country be able to really have some amazing breakthroughs because of their charisma and their kind of vision. And I think that kind of amazing development on the continent would probably only come from some really visionary leadership that's able to come in and, as we mentioned, kind of bring the continent together to leverage its collective strength.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's happening now. It's not 2040. If you look at from the innovation, or you look at from the creativity, look from the fashion, you look from entertainment, I mean, you see the Afrobeats taking over music. You see Mapiano, dominating, around the globe. And you see the content in terms of like how the Africa content is been up. It's a beginning of something which is great. And that beginning has been shaped by the youth of Africa. It's been shaped by, not from politics, not from any policy. It's been shaped by that creativity, that innovation. And I think that's what is needed to fuel that. The policy and the governments and the free trade can come in, is to fueling that energy that comes from Africans. And I think, which is why I'm seeing that the next 2040, it's probably something that Africa can teach the world of how we could be able to have economies that put people first. We call it Ubuntu economy, which is where it's no longer about extraction, but where we all grow together for the betterment of humankind.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. We have just about 3 minutes left, but I think we can wrap up with kind of 30 seconds from each of our guests of a final thought. So around our topic of Africa, opportunity in the world's richest continent, what's one final thought you'd like to leave with the audience? Ozzy, start us off.
Listen to the people of Africa.
Love it. Thank you.
I can't best that.
I will just say that I'm leaving this panel feeling a little bit more optimistic than perhaps I was feeling at the beginning, so I appreciate that and the comments from everyone, but watch this space, I guess.
Yeah, I can just say it's time for Africa now.
All right. So, Ozzy, Abubakar, Lizzie, Luvoyo, thanks so much for taking time to share insights with our community. Really appreciate each of you in doing this. Maybe if you stick around, you'll see Luvoyo dance. But, I don't know. But thanks to all of you for attending. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks so much.